My name is Mark. I'm 48 years old and been working on and off in commercial fishing most of my life, mostly crab. I don't really go online much, to be honest. My daughter just found your channel through a friend and they insisted me to share my story with your viewers. I told her most of it's just cold hands, bad sleep, and long days. But there is one thing I still think about sometime. I couldn't really explain properly. This would have been about 15 years ago. I was in my early 30s then. Been crabbing maybe 10 years at that point. Not new, but still learning plenty. We were out at Dutch Harbor, fishing opilio crab in the Bering Sea, about late October. Weather was pretty normal for that time. Cold, gray, a bit rough, but workable. Maybe 8 to 12 foot seas, steady wind, not the kind of day you remember for the weather. Crew was small. Dan was the skipper. Steady guy, didn't talk much unless he had to. Then there was me and two other deckhands, Eric and Jonah. Good guys. We worked together before, so everything ran smooth. That morning, we were hauling a string like usual. Nothing special about it. You get into a rhythm doing that. Hook the buoy, run the line through, bring the pot up, dump it, sort, rebait, stack. Same thing over and over. A few pots in, Eric hooks the next buoy and says, "Feels heavier than usual." Didn't think much of it. Happens all the time. Mud, maybe something tangled up. So we just kept going. Dan gave the hauler a little more power and we started bringing it up. You could tell it wasn't just a full pot though. The line had a different kind of pull. Slower, heavier, like it was dragging something along with it. When the pot came up through the water, I noticed right away it looked darker than usual, like something was covering part of it. Then we got it over the rail and set it down. There was a shark caught up in it. Took me a second to really process what I was looking at, but yeah, it was a great white. Big one, too. I'm not great at judging length, but it had to be around 15 feet. Thick body, solid animal. It was dead. Had been for a bit, you could tell. Nothing extreme, just the usual signs. Dan leaned out of the wheelhouse and asked, "What have you got there?" "Shark," I said. "Big one." He came down, took a look with the rest of us. At first, it was just kind of surprising. You don't expect to pull something like that up on a crab pot. But then Eric pointed at its side. "Look at that." Right behind the head, there was a chunk missing. Not a bunch of little marks or tearing, just one area like something had taken a bite out of it. We estimated the bite around 4 feet in width. It wasn't messy in the way you'd expect, more like a single, clean section gone. Dan crouched down a bit and looked at it carefully. "That's not from the gear," he said. Jonah asked us, "Another shark?" We thought it could be a much larger one, but hard to say. That was the honest answer. None of us really knew. We've all seen fish get chewed up, but this looked different enough to stand out. It didn't look fresh, but it didn't look as old as the rest of the body either. Just off, in a way I can't really describe better than that. We didn't stand around long, still had work to do, so we got our knives and started cutting it loose from the pot. It was packed pretty tight around the frame and line, so it took a few minutes. Nobody was saying much while we worked. Not out of fear or anything, just focused. You don't want to slip up when you're dealing with heavy gear and something like that on deck. Once we got it free, we pushed it back over the side. It hit the water hard and rolled once before floating way out of sight. We reset the pot and moved on. That's kind of how it goes out there. Something unusual happens, you deal with it, then you keep working. But I'd admit it stayed in the back of my mind the rest of the day. Later on, near the end of the string, Eric pointed off the side and said, "You see that?" There was something moving under the surface. Not fast, not splashing, just a shape passing through. Could have been anything, honestly. Hard to tell with that kind of water. It didn't stick around long enough to get a good look. Jonah said, probably just another shark, and that was about it. No one argued with him. It was the simplest explanation. That night, we were in the galley having coffee, warming up a bit. Conversation drifted back to it for a minute. Eric said, "That bite still doesn't make sense to me." Dan just nodded and said, "There's always bigger fish out there." And that was it. No big theories or anything, just left it alone. We didn't report it or write anything up. There wasn't really a reason to. Dead shark in the gear, had a bite on it, not much else to say. I've had rougher days, scarier moments even. Weather, equipment failures, that kind of thing sticks with you more in a practical way. I'd like to tell more of my experiences after you get this one out, but that one stayed with me for a different reason. Just because it was one of those quiet reminders. You can spend years doing the same job, thinking you've got a pretty good handle on things, and then something small comes along that doesn't quite fit, and you don't really get an answer for it. You just move on and keep working. More support to your channel, and thank you to the ones listening.
Last summer, my cousin Joey and I were about 6 miles out in the Gulf. We were in his 19-foot skiff, a great boat for the flats, but a little cramped when things go sideways. We planned this whole trip with 2 other friends, but it didn't went according to plan. But as summer was going by, I thought it might be a good idea to just go for it. Joey was all in for it immediately after I called him. This wasn't a well-planned trip, to be honest. Both of us were just mad about our 2 friends making a lot of lame excuses, so we just headed off our way. We bought some beers and borrowed some nets, fishing rods, and hooks from our dads. It was all going expected for the first few hours. We were bottom fishing for snapper, having a beer, and enjoying a day that was almost too calm. Then Joey's heavy rod doubled over. We had a few bites before this, but this one took us by surprise. At first, we thought he'd snagged a reef or maybe hooked a massive grouper. The line was peeling off the reel with this steady, heavy pressure. It took him 20 minutes of back and forth pumping and winding before we saw a flash of bronze beneath the surface. It was a black-tipped shark, maybe 5 or 6 feet long. Not a Jaws monster, but a solid 100 pounds of pure prehistoric muscle. Normally, we just snip the leader and let it go, but the shark had swallowed the hook deep, and it was trailing about 30 feet of heavy-duty braided line that was getting tangled in our propeller. Joey, being stubborn and wanting his $20 lure back, decided we should bring it alongside to get a better angle with the long-handled pliers. That was the first mistake. As soon as the shark's head broke the surface, it went from lethargic to chainsaw. In a massive surge of adrenaline, the shark thrashed, caught the edge of the gunwale, and literally flopped its way over the side and into the floor of the boat. We were a bit scared and trash-talking each other while it was on our floor. I grabbed my phone to take a snap of it and upload it on my Instagram, but as I was about to take a picture of it, it suddenly became more aggressive, bumping onto the sides on our deck. Out of panic, I accidentally dropped my phone and just paid attention on grabbing line and pulling it away from us. If you've never been in a confined space with a 100-pound angry fish, it's hard to describe the sound. Joey scrambled onto the casting deck and I jumped up on the cooler. The shark was losing its mind, tail whipping everything in sight. It smashed our tackle box, sending hundreds of hooks and lead sinkers flying across the deck like shrapnel. Then the real problem started. The shark's tail slammed into the fuel line. With one violent thrash, the shark's sandpaper skin and sheer force popped the quick disconnect fitting on the external fuel tank. Suddenly, we had highly flammable gasoline spraying all over the deck, mixing with the slime and the flopping shark. To make matters worse, the shark had managed to wedge its head under the center console wiring. I could hear wires stretching and snapping. If a spark hit that gasoline-soaked floor, the boat would have turned into a fireball in seconds. "Don't move," I yelled at Joey, who was reaching for a gaff. "The gas, Joey, look at the floor." We were trapped on our perches, watching this shark thrash in a pool of fuel and salt water, inches away from the battery terminals. One accidental short circuit from a loose wire, and we were going for a very long swim. We sat there for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 90 seconds, waiting for the shark to tire out. Eventually, it settled into a heavy, rhythmic heaving. I reached down with a boat hook, snagged the shark by the pectoral fin, and we managed to slide it back over the side. It didn't even swim away fast. It just sank into the blue, looking as exhausted as we felt. The boat was a wreck. There was blood, slime, and gasoline everywhere. We spent 2 hours scrubbing the deck with Dawn soap and a hand pump, terrified to even turn the key to start the engine for fear of a spark. We eventually got back to the dock, but the smell of gas stayed in that fiberglass for weeks. Now, if I hook anything with more than 2 rows of teeth, I cut the line while it's still 10 feet away. No lure is worth a boat fire. This happened about 3 years ago while we were crossing the North Atlantic, the Big Gray. I was an able seaman on a vessel carrying 1,000 containers. When you're on a ship that's 3 football fields long, you feel invincible. You feel like you're on a floating island. But when a storm hits in the middle of the graveyard of the Atlantic, that island starts to feel very, very small. It was the graveyard watch, 02 to 06. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, and the swells were huge, maybe 10 meters, slamming into the bow with a sound like a freight train hitting a brick wall. I was on the bridge with the second mate. The radar was sweeping, a rhythmic green line cutting through the sea clutter, the interference caused by the waves. Suddenly, a solid blip appeared. No automatic identification system signal. That's AIS for short. No name, no heading, no speed, just a stationary object about 4 miles out. In the middle of the Atlantic, you don't just stop. If you're sitting still, you're either a buoy that's drifted 1,000 miles off course, or you're in serious trouble. The mate grabbed the binoculars, but with the spray in the dark, you couldn't see 10 feet past the bow. We adjusted course slightly to pass it by half a mile. As we got closer, the blip didn't move. It just sat there, a tiny dot against our massive wake. As we drew level with the coordinates, the mate hit the ship's massive searchlight. The beam cut through the rain like a white blade. It wasn't a ship, it was a lifeboat. Not one of ours, a small orange enclosed capsule-style boat, the kind you see on oil rigs or tankers. It was bobbing violently, half submerged, looking like a discarded pill bottle in a washing machine. Protocol says you have to investigate. You can't just leave a potential survivor. The captain was called to the bridge, and we slowed the engines, which is a nightmare in heavy seas, because you lose steerage. We maneuvered the island as close as we dared. "Someone's in there," the mate whispered. Through the searchlight's glare, we could see a face in the small reinforced porthole of the lifeboat, a pale, wide-eyed face. They weren't waving, they weren't signaling for help, they were just staring. The captain ordered a boarding party. I was part of it. We didn't go in a small boat, too dangerous in those swells. Instead, we used the ship's crane to lower a recovery cage. 2 of us went down, swinging wildly over the churning black water, looking like bait on a fishing line. We got close enough to hook the lifeboat's lifting eye. The whole time, that face was in the window. It didn't move. It didn't blink. We hauled the lifeboat onto the deck of the container ship. It hit the steel plating with a heavy, wet thud. The wind was howling through the containers, making a sound like 1,000 flutes played by a madman. The captain stood back with a flashlight. "Open it," he barked. I cracked the manual seal. The smell hit me first.
It wasn't the smell of a dead body. It was the smell of old copper and ozone. The lifeboat was empty. We checked every corner. It was a 21-man capsule. There were 4 sets of harnesses, 4 emergency rations, all unopened, and enough fresh water for a month. But there was no one inside. "I saw a face, Cap," the mate said, his voice cracking over the radio. "We both saw it, right there in the porthole." I looked at the porthole from the inside. There were handprints. Not just oily smudges, but clear, desperate prints etched into the salt crust on the inside of the glass. But the seat directly behind the window was strapped shut, pristine, as if no one had sat there in years. Then I saw the logbook tucked into the side pocket. I opened it. The last entry was dated 6 months prior. It was from a Turkish freighter that had gone down with all hands in the Mediterranean. We were in the North Atlantic. That little orange pod had drifted thousands of miles through some of the roughest water on Earth, through winter gales and blistering heat. It had crossed an entire ocean alone, with its hatches sealed tight from the inside. We never found out whose face we saw. The company told us it was optical shimmer, a trick of the searchlight hitting the salt on the glass. They told us the handprints were probably from the original crew before the ship sank. But I know what I saw. That face wasn't looking for rescue. It looked like it was watching a movie it had seen 1,000 times before. We ended up welding the hatch shut and dropping the pod back into the water a few hundred miles later. The captain didn't want it on his ship. He said it felt heavy. For the rest of that hitch, every time I walked past the deck at night, I felt like someone was standing just outside the circle of my flashlight, waiting for me to turn around. The ocean is big, man, and some things that go missing out there, they don't exactly stay gone. They just change.